These are verses that if you actually take them at face value for what they are saying, you will be forced to reject this God. Because you would say, I want to believe in a God that's good, that's just, that's loving. And that's not here. That's not this. Hi, welcome to Joel Reads Bible. I'm Joel, and I read Bible so that you don't have to. And this is one of our special recap episodes where we're recapping not 10 episodes, or 10 chapters, I should say, but 6 chapters? Leviticus 21 to 27. And that surprised me. Let me just tell you, I sat down today because I was like, okay, let's do the last 5 chapters of Leviticus, because for some reason, I thought Leviticus had 33 chapters in it. But when I took a look, I suddenly realized we've finished Leviticus. Leviticus stops at chapter 27. So it's time to do a recap. And I don't think I'm going to do an overarching, all of Leviticus recap like I have done for the other books, where I just do a complete sort of overview. Because I think we know what the book was. It was laws, essentially. A lot of them were ceremonial as far as how to kill an animal for Yahweh, which isn't necessary anymore. And then a bunch of laws, which also aren't necessary anymore, it turns out, except for the odd one that you might still like if you're a bigot. But we're not going to go over those in great detail because I think that they are there in the chapters if you would like to go back and look at the Leviticus playlist. I read the whole thing and it's all there, so just enjoy that. So we'll jump right into Leviticus chapter 21, verse 7, where we understand that there are things that are not becoming of a woman. And there's not as many things, I think, when it comes to relationships that are or aren't becoming of a man. It's a lot more clear what's not becoming of a woman. In this case, they shall not marry a woman who is a prostitute or profane. I don't know what profane is supposed to mean. I assume it's probably something to do with the language that she uses. Maybe if she swears standing in doorways, like, you son of a gun, but uses the B word or something. We don't want to marry a woman like that. It's not very becoming of a lady, A priest shall not marry a woman divorced from her husband. There's just certain things that a woman can't do and still be accepted. Men, on the other hand, they can have multiple wives. I'm sure that they're not really necessarily allowed to be profane, but even if they are profane, they can buy a woman. It doesn't go both ways, you know what I mean? This is just another way where the men who are writing this are controlling a woman. And that's something to think about as we go through this episode and the rest of the Bible. Does it make sense if it's just like a person of a time writing this? And the answer is typically going to be yes. But then if you ask, does this make sense that a God that is timeless, who loves women just as much as men, wrote this? The answer is going to be harder to say a resounding yes. It's going to be more complicated and difficult to answer. Also, as we've been going through Leviticus, there's been a lot of things as far as rules and laws when it comes to different types of sacrifices and these kinds of things, and even sort of sex laws and stuff like that, where if you read in Genesis, a lot of the stuff that's mentioned was done there. It's mentioned there too. Also, the development of which nations we are going to attack and which nations we hate, as far as Canaan and stuff like that. This, of course, is still going to develop. We're going to see this develop. But that's going to connect directly with things like the sexual assault of Lot by his daughters, or the thing that happened with Ham and Noah. That sort of stuff seems like propaganda, which will excuse the genocides that are going to come later. There is a theory that all of this stuff was written at the same time during the Babylonian captivity. But if that's the case, then these early stories, which I also assume were probably word of mouth, are written in a very primitive sort of way. They're very vague. They're very simple. And as we move forward, we get more character development and more detail. And it's like this stuff actually matters now because this is where we're really living. We're really living in the times where we kill a bunch of animals. We get the simplicity of Jacob's ladder, but then we get the massive set piece of this parting of the Red Sea. These kinds of contrasts where it's actually kind of interesting and creative that the people coming up with this would have those simple stories where there's not a lot of detail, not much going on, and then build to something a little bit more complex and detailed. And maybe those old stories were stories they had shared word of mouth, and they were like, okay, let's just get these out. These are our little myths, and then we'll start being creative in our new fiction. It actually puts me in mind of The Hobbit. If you read The Hobbit, it's a pretty simple kind of a kid's book. It's very rudimentary. And then all of a sudden, Lord of the Rings shows up, and it's super, super detailed and complicated and difficult to read, and thank God there's movies, that kind of thing. So I feel like that's sort of happening here in the Pentateuch. Then in verse 13, we have another kind of shot against women. He shall take a wife in her virginity. There's an overarching theme here that virginity is the value of a woman. That is certainly going to be an attitude of a man who wants to have a piece of property that hasn't been tainted by another man, right? Hasn't been touched by another man in that way. These are men who get really, really jealous, and it grosses them out to think of their property being with another man. Or for some reason, God likes the virginity of a woman. By the way, never really worries about it or mentions it when it comes to a man. So it's not sexual purity for everyone. It's not virginity for everyone. It's specifically for women. And this brings me to this other idea that I've been observing, which is that everything necessary for procreation is sinful or makes you unclean, which I think are probably not miles apart as far as concepts. Being unclean is probably similar to having sin on you or something along those lines. But every single part, having a period, you need a period for the way reproduction works in humans. Ejaculation, you need to ejaculate, guys. I'm sorry, but that makes you unclean. It takes away your value to finally do the thing that is required to procreate. So if you zoom out and really pay attention, God created a system by which following his first command would make you unclean. Everything necessary for following that command makes you unclean. Keep in mind, he can do it any way he wants. Use your imagination, right? He could be fruitful and multiply. All you have to do is rub fingers and you will multiply. And rubbing fingers is always good. It's always what I want you guys to do. You're not unclean if you do that. You can imagine any sort of scenario. It would make more sense than, hey, I want you guys to be fruitful and multiply, but if you do any of the things required to be fruitful and multiply, I will consider you unclean until evening, or it will strip you of your value entirely. It's like, what is wrong with you, God? Chapter 14 reiterates this idea that is also happening throughout the whole entire book. He shall take a virgin of his own people as a wife. You got to keep the bloodline pure. We're not taking wives from other bloodlines. We do not want other nations, other people. And that ethnocentrism, that nationalism doesn't stop. It doesn't end. That goes on forever, for the whole entire book. This book isn't for the Gentiles. This isn't for you or I. This is for Hebrews, right? This is for ancient Hebrews. This is their religion. This is their practice. This is their God, who they wrote, who loves them and only wants them to be with them. So it just boggles my mind that there is this weird kind of co-opting of this and this imagining that the God this whole time, like even here, because he's timeless, he doesn't change his mind, he's always the same. The whole time, he actually loves you, somebody who knows, maybe is a descendant from a Canaanite, or any other race that isn't the Hebrews, who is, it seems, intrinsically an enemy to the Hebrews. It's a very weird thing to take ownership of something that has nothing to do with you and is so utterly clearly for other people, And they are like pushing back. They're saying, no, thank you. We don't want you. We're going to stick with our own bloodline. We're going to marry our own people. That's the best case scenario. Go away. So then we get to chapter 22, where it opens with the verse that says, "Tell Aaron and his sons to separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, which they make holy to me, and that they not profane my holy name. I am Yahweh." It's like holy is said 3 times in that verse, and it's hard to know what it means. Like, these are holy things of the children of Israel, which they make holy to him, that they not profane his holy name. And there's other verses that say that we are made holy through he that is holy. And so how did these things get holy? They're the children of Israel's things, and they made them holy to God. Like, what's holy mean? What does it mean? We have songs, Christian hymns like "Holy, Holy, Holy." It's just you're repeating the word holy because obviously it doesn't mean anything. So you just have to say the same thing over and over again and hope that everybody gets lulled into a sense of like, oh yeah, we sort of vaguely kind of know what that maybe sort of means. It's just this made up word that, again, probably has like 8 definitions to it, and they change just based on context. And it's kind of a catch-all term. God is better than everyone else. He's more pure than anyone else. He's set apart. He sets other things apart, something along those lines. Sometimes it makes sense that it's set apart, and sometimes it probably makes sense that it's righteous, and sometimes it probably makes sense that it's pure. But it's just this vague sort of made-up word that everybody seems to get on board with, and then also attributes to God in such a way that seems to carry weight. And that's the part that's really surprising to me. It's like, it's because he's so holy. But what does it mean? I don't know, but he is that, and so that's why he does certain things. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. So in this chapter, we also had mentioned that the priests can have slaves, which was very surprising, that even the priests, the holiest of people. And one thing that's interesting to note there is that, well, God's letting these people do what they need to do, because that's what they're going to do of a time. This is a common apologetic. And so everyone was doing slavery. He let these evil people, these awful people, these sinful people do their sinful thing. He didn't condone it, but he allowed it. But here we're learning that the priests, his holy people, his consecrated people, right? These are the main guys who they are super important, and they have to live a certain way. They can't marry certain women. They can't do certain things. But they can own slaves. And this is kind of the irony. They have to have nice balls, okay? It's incredibly important that their balls are not crushed, they're not tampered with, they haven't been injured in any way. Perfect balls. But they're allowed to have slaves. These are the priorities, okay? If you think that God's like allowing people to sin and he doesn't prefer it, he doesn't condone it, he thinks it's wrong, but he's just allowing them to do it, he's allowing his priesthood to do it, right? He's allowing his best people to do it. But if they have messed up balls, they're out. As we debate people online, there were people that were saying, hey, you can't even go in the sanctuary if you have messed up balls. Like, God is going to reject you. Will you even be able to go to heaven? And one of the rabbis that hangs out in the space was like, well, that is just for the priests. You can't be a priest. You can't be the highest, holiest of the people if you have messed up balls. That is just, God loves balls, right? But you can keep slaves. So my point in all of this is to say that when God has the highest of all standards, the physical deformity he is not interested in. He wants everything to be perfect. And that perfection includes slavery. We can't be impure. We can't have iniquity. We can't have but we can keep slaves. The priests have slaves. I'm repeating myself, but the next time you hear the apologetic that God was just allowing these flawed people to do what they wanted to do, this shows that isn't true, because he held the priests to the highest standard of righteousness. The priorities of this God are incredibly messed up. There are different places in the Bible, and we're going to be talking about Genesis 17 a little later. And this also happens in Exodus 12, where God says, hey, you got a slave, a foreign slave living with you, being a slave to you in your home, circumcise them. Just make sure they're circumcised, and then they can have the Passover. And so people are like, well, that's them becoming part of the family, right? They're including them. This is how they've become Hebrews now. I'm not so confident that they're like an equal part of the family. They are property of the family, and so they are part of the estate. So you wouldn't want somebody who's filthy and uncircumcised as one of your, I don't know, pets or something like that, or one of your pieces of property. They're not a son or an uncle. You are adjusting them to fit into your aesthetic. It's like you're painting a dresser that you get, or you're cutting off a boxer's tail, right? You don't want that tail wiggling around, knocking stuff off shelves. You've got this slave who's not circumcised. Well, you're circumcising them so that they are in the group and they match your property, right? They fall into your culture and the prerequisites of your culture, so that when you're having a meal, like the Passover or something, you don't have to make a whole separate meal or something like that. It's just like, yeah, they can be part of it. We've circumcised them, so we don't have to have any special considerations for these people. The thing that's often ignored, of course, is that there's no mention of the slave being like, I want my penis cut. I would love for that to happen. No, it's just like, you can do that to them. That's basically your penis at this point. So just do whatever you want with it. That's not good, guys. This is an awful thing. This isn't a positive. This isn't a score for Bible. This is a score against it. In verse 13, it says, but if a priest's daughter is a widow or divorced or has no child and has returned to her father's house as in her youth, she may eat of her father's bread, but no stranger shall eat any of it. So this is a little bit misogynistic and a little bit ethnocentric again, and tribal. It flies in the face of God loving everyone equally, as mentioned earlier. God loves the Hebrews, Hebrews for Hebrews. If this daughter comes back and she has no child, so there's no other child that is of a different sort of nation or ethnicity again, yeah, she can return. She can be part of the family again. If we get some kid that's mixed race or some other stranger who would be probably a foreigner from another nation, no, hard pass, get out of here. We're not interested. You're impure. Don't mess up our situation. This is Hebrews for Hebrews, and that's it. Look, as the people of the time who were very tribal, this probably was important. Maybe they were being protective, or maybe they just weren't very gracious with the nations around them. That very well could be the case. But as a God, if this is the God saying it, we always have to remember that. We can't separate this from God. These are quoted as God saying them. So if you want to believe this garbage, then you have to believe that God is the one that doesn't want a child who is of another nation hanging out with his mommy and the priest daddy. That's a bad situation for him. He's against that. He wants only Hebrews in the Hebrew household. That's gross. That's gross. If it's coming from God, it's gross. And this kind of coincides with the slave thing, because what we have is a slave who is a foreigner who will be absorbed by the home. And this is me just guessing, guys, honestly. The slave is being absorbed into the home. It's being circumcised. It's part of the family. Not really, but like a dog, you know. And that's fine. But if it's the husband to the daughter or even a child, it's maybe a case where the male person has autonomy and is free and can make decisions and all those things. So they don't want someone who has that kind of individual power to be able to be part of the family. They don't want them in there. They don't want that sort of influence. Someone they can control and dominate. You're just a little dog and we're going to do what we want with you. That's fine. But if you get someone that's like, oh, I'm a fully autonomous person, please, no, we can't have that because that's probably going to mess with our culture and influence us. And maybe they'll start marrying or sleeping with 6 or 7 other of our women, and we don't want that. We want to keep the bloodline pure. A slave, no problem. In verse 25, it says, you must not offer any of these as the bread of your God from the hand of a foreigner, because their corruption is in them. There is a defect in them. They shall not be accepted for you. So just by virtue of being a foreigner, it's corrupt. Being a non-Hebrew is a defect. You can't accept those things and give it to Yahweh. And I think that we see this in other places in Genesis where, certain kings or whatever offered Abraham certain things for free. Here, have some of my land to bury your wife. That might have been Jacob or Isaac or Jacob as well. They're like, no, we will not be accepting anything from any foreign. We're going to pay full price. These things are probably corrupted. We don't want to accept things from other nations. And again, flawed reasoning, tribal, things like that. But as God, you got to go, all right, is this good? Is this the way we should be doing it? Everybody, let's stay divided. That we're, us versus them. Let's start othering other people. Like, it seems, again, kind of gross to me. So then in chapter 23, I kept on mentioning that, what's a convocation? I know what a convocation is as far as graduating or something like that. But what is a convocation, biblically speaking? It seemed like a new idea and was very, very foreign. So I was confused. I still don't really know what that entails entirely. But it does seem to be some sort of a formal ceremony or meal or something along those lines, more Sabbath type stuff, where God actually sort of shows up in the heat of the Sabbath or something like that. It seems like this Sabbath idea is getting out of hand. It's like giving an inch and you take a mile. It's like, take a day. Well, now every 7 years we're going to have a mega Sabbath, or every 50th Sabbath after the 7th Sabbath, we're going to have a whole other kind of Sabbath. It's so many different Sabbaths, and the threats, if you work on the Sabbath, you're going to be killed, and all sorts of wild things with the Sabbath. And now we have this, holy ceremony, convocation thing on the Sabbath. It's just the Sabbath is getting out of hand. Just calm down with the Sabbath. And the irony is a lot of Christians who, again, really do like this book, really laid back about the Sabbath. There's 3 verses in the Bible that say, men shouldn't sleep with men or something like that. And then there's 300 that say, respect the Sabbath, don't work on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is my day. You must keep the Sabbath for all time. You will be keeping this Sabbath. And everyone's like, he wasn't serious about the Sabbath, but he hates gays. What is wrong with you guys? What is wrong with you? Just talk about the epitome of cherry picking. You're like, I got to work on a Sunday or Saturday or whichever day. I can't take a day off. But I hate the LGBTQ community because the 2 verses that sort of say God's not a fan of certain activities. Guys, get a grip. Read the actual Bible and stop being so stupid. Read the actual Bible and either really commit to the whole thing, which please don't because there's a lot of nonsense in there, or just dump it. Right? You can dump the whole thing because you've dumped most of it already anyway. In verse 14, it says, you must not eat bread or roasted grain or fresh grain until the same day, until you have brought the offering of your God. This is a statute forever throughout your generations and all your dwellings. So in verse 14, we get another reminder that this is a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. We're doing some sort of a wave offering. We're waving a sheaf or something like that. Burnt offering, flour. We're burning grain. We're doing a drink offering. We're doing all sorts of different things. All of that is supposed to go on forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You buy the Sabbath thing. You're kind of ignoring it, but you still believe in the Ten Commandments, right? But the Sabbath. And this is all part of the same law book that gives us the Ten Commandments, gives us love your neighbor in Leviticus 19. It really gives us everything. And then it says it's going to be perpetually done forever. But for some reason, again, as a Christian, you're going, no, that one's not important. It's really dumb, guys. I'm just repeating myself at this point. You have to stop doing that. And then we get, of course, verse 21. And just to reiterate it, this is a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. And what is going on here is a burnt offering. So we are going to be doing burnt offerings forever. But one thing that we do also notice in these passages, which is a way that Gentiles can get out of this, and as a Christian you can get out of this, foreigners are not to participate in this. The only way a foreigner is going to be able to participate in this is if they become a slave of a Hebrew and are circumcised into that family, right? Then you can participate. Again, you're probably not going to be a Hebrew per se. You're not really going to be part of the family. But if you're a Christian and you really want to be part of this, why don't you become some Jewish person's slave? Then you can actually biblically participate in the things that are supposed to be going on forever, which, by the way, nobody is doing. But as a Gentile, this really should offend you. Like, as a Christian, you should be like, oh, I'm not welcome here? Like, God doesn't want this from me? No, he doesn't want this from you. And again, there's no reason to separate this from love your neighbor or don't covet your neighbor's slaves or any of the other verses that are in these books. Everything is fine. There's no way for you to sin. You are not under the law. This is not a book for you. You are just a Gentile. You are a Christian. You shouldn't even really be a Christian because Christianity needs this to survive. This is the underpinning of that religion. So it fails. It's a failure. You can just leave it alone. Just walk away. This is a waste of time unless you want to become a slave. And again, there's two places in this chapter where it says this is going on forever. This is going to be what I want you guys to do forever and ever. Amen. For you to go, no, he stopped this with Jesus. That's just you lying to yourself. It doesn't make any sense. So then we get to Leviticus chapter 24 and the second verse or whatever here. It says, command the children of Israel that they bring to you pure olive oil beaten for the light to cause a lamp to burn continually. Why is that going on? It seems so unnecessary, right? So God wants something to happen, something that is like ultimately unnecessary. And later on, as a Christian, you're going to say, well, this was a metaphor. And that goes for all the killing of the animals and all those sacrifices. We know they were unnecessary. We know that God made the Hebrews do those things so that there would be a sweet, sweet metaphor that Jesus could overturn or embody or whatever you want to call it. This is what's kind of interesting. If the thing in the metaphor is unnecessary, right? Like if keeping a lamp burning 24 hours a day is not necessary, it's just being done as an object lesson, then the thing that it's the metaphor for, whatever that may be, will also be unnecessary, right? Like the thing that is the metaphor should be necessary if you want to show that the other thing is necessary. But if the thing here is unnecessary, then it's just an object lesson, then this thing is also bound to be unnecessary. It makes it a lot less cool or compelling. Then we get to Leviticus 25, and this is like the big slavery chapter in Leviticus, and I would even say in all of the Bible. It's the one that's the most direct and the most heinous. But one thing that makes this seem so obviously man-made and fictional is that there seems to be a direct contradiction, and nobody really talks about this. I really haven't heard people mention it, and maybe I'm just reading it wrong. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you the two different passages, and you can decide if they're saying the same thing. And keep in mind that in the story, in the narrative of the story, Exodus 21 is happening at the exact same time that Leviticus 25 is happening. This is still God talking to Moses on Mount Sinai. I don't know how long that takes. Like in the same, maybe it's like a month or something. Like he's going up and God's dictating all these laws. And we're just going to focus on the Hebrew male servant. Okay, so I'm going to read Exodus 21 2 to 6. And maybe I'll go down and read the ones where you can beat him, but we're not going to read the ones about the female servants. And then I'm going to go to Leviticus 25 and just see if these two ideas conflict at all in your mind. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th, he shall go out free without paying anything. So you can buy a Hebrew servant, and he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free. So you've purchased him, he is your slave. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he is married, then his wife shall go out with him. Okay? If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's. So it still belongs to the master. And he shall go out by himself. But if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him to God. And then the master pierces his ear and he serves him forever. Then it says later, if a man strikes his servant or his maid with a rod, and he dies under his hand, the man shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if his servant gets up after a day or two, he shall not be punished, for his servant is his property. And this version says servant, but it is slave ultimately. And then we go to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 39. If your brother has grown poor among you and sells himself to you, you must not make him serve as a slave. As a hired servant and as a temporary resident, he shall be with you. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. So he's a hired servant. So if he sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. Originally, it did seem like they were owned as a slave, but maybe that's just where the wording is a little bit funny. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family and to the possessions of his father. So this must be the children that he came in with, that he goes out with. But if he makes children there, he can't leave with them. And the master can own him for life if the guy decides to do that. So is he a hired servant for life? Like he will never go free? He'll be his property for life? These cause some sort of a rub in my mind. I have a hard time reconciling these two things, unless in Exodus 21, it's just not slavery. It's talking about this version of being a hired servant and living with him. But if he stays, he's still a hired servant. You have to keep him as a hired servant forever? For these are my servants who I brought up out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. But you are buying, because here it says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, so you are buying him. In the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with harshness, but fear your God. If you are beating someone to the point where they are just getting up after a day or two, but you're beating them to that extent, I'm sorry, but that's harsh. There's no way around it. If you wanted to not be harsh with someone, don't beat them. Just say you can't beat this person who's your hired servant who you pay regularly. But the thing is that there are people here that you are paying regularly, right? There's different classes of people. So anyway, I feel like those two passages are contradicting each other, but maybe somebody has more insight into that. But this whole notion of slavery is ridiculous. And if we go back to the first mention of slaves in Genesis 12, God could have said, hey, why don't we not do slaves? This was when Abraham pimped his wife and he got a bunch of slaves from Pharaoh. He could have been like, no thanks, we don't do slaves with the Israel. They weren't Israel yet, but we don't do slaves in our nation, in our culture. Then in chapter 17 in Genesis, when God is saying, hey, circumcise your slaves, he could have said, hey, don't have any slaves. There's no good reason to be doing slaves. And this is back in the day when the Lord appeared to Abraham, right? Like this wasn't some sort of like, message from on high, mysterious, whatever. The Lord just showed up and was like, hey, this just in, please don't do slaves. I'm saying please, but you got to do what I say. Don't do slaves. Chapter 25, verse 23, there is a verse that's like, hey, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. He's talking about land that these people don't live on. They're at the base of Mount Sinai, which seems very premature. This is why I would agree with any scholar that would say that these books are written at a totally different time, probably when they're actually in a land, because then it's applicable. If I were a Hebrew, I'd be like, I don't care right now. Why are you giving me laws about land? I don't have land. We're going to be wandering around here for 40 years. I don't think I need to know about how we're going to deal with land and possession and redemption or whatever. Why don't you tell me when I get there? So in these books, we have a lot of laws which are simply not practical for us, but maybe were practical for the people at the time. They seem to make sense for them, probably having to do with health. I think I mentioned certain meat and how to prepare it and stuff like that. Maybe was necessary back then because they didn't have the same quality of meat, or they didn't have the same ability to refrigerate the meat. But to us now, we would just go, oh, that seems unnecessary. We don't need to worry about that stuff. And then there's some laws that are just like completely bonkers. They're just out there. Like nobody would need them ever at any time, except we now will say, oh, they're spiritual. They're metaphorical. They have some sort of a lesson there. And you have to do that, right? Because you don't want to just be like, oh yeah, no, that was just people making stuff up at the time and it made sense to them at the time and that's all it needs to be. You have to make this, the timeless God problem, right? And the same thing goes with Jesus' prophecies, right? The Hebrew people at the time imagined what these prophecies would mean. And those prophecies were incredibly practical. And I'm jumping ahead. When they thought that the Messiah would be a king, they actually literally thought he'd be a king and that he would free them, that he would save them from their captors and bring peace on earth in literal ways. This is how this is literally going to pan out. But it doesn't. It didn't. It hasn't. So the Christian now has to say, oh, it was a metaphorical kingdom. He was a metaphorical king. He was a king in a spiritual sense. He overcame the world in a spiritual way. All of a sudden you have to start massaging the text and what it's saying to fit the fact that nothing's happened, that it's not real, that it's not true. And so we see that happening all the way down at every single level, on every rung of the ladder. It's always just trying to negotiate for a text that fails. It says, nevertheless, in the cities of the Levites may redeem the houses in the cities of their possession at any time. The Levites may redeem the house that was sold, and the city of his possession it shall be released in the Jubilee, for the houses of the city of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel. It's sort of seeming like the Levites, of course, they can take any house anytime that they want at any given moment, and it always belongs to them. And there's mention here that like the Hebrew doesn't really own anything. This is the land that belongs to God or the Levites. This kind of makes me think of like a right-wing conspiracy theory where the government is trying to take over all of our homes and take possession of everything that belongs to us. I think this is the World Economic Forum that apparently somebody said, they shall own nothing, but they will be happy. And I've heard Christians talk about this in a paranoid sort of way, that they're terrified that there's this cabal to own all of our stuff and our homes, our real estate, and we're just slaves to these people. Well, would it be fine if God was at the helm? Would it be fine if this was the Levitical priesthood that ran the World Economic Forum and that they sort of own everything and you can just be happy with that? Because that's what the book here is suggesting. The book here is suggesting that you own nothing, but you're fine with it because God. So it sounds like a bit of a double standard if you ask me. And I always mention it if there is a verse that says that this is going to go on forever. 34, but the field of the pasture lands of their city may not be sold, for it is their perpetual possession. So the Levites perpetually own certain cities, I suppose it seems to be saying. But this is the Levites just really digging into nepotism, because they're saying like, we're going to own certain things forever. And churches are like that, like just look around. These churches, they have millions of dollars worth of property all over the world. And the Levites are the ones that sort of started this whole thing where they're just like, yeah, there's certain things that we just own. You can't take it away from us, and we'll perpetually own it forever, pass it down to our families, that and our slaves. Don't mess with us. So I spent a lot of time in Leviticus chapter 25 talking about slavery, where chapter 25 here seems to be lessening the impact of the Hebrew on Hebrew slavery. But this is the part that really highlights the harshest form of slavery, I would say, even though I think that we're going to learn about other forms of slavery the Hebrews are going to do, enslaving other nations that they invade. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. But in this case, this is just like straightforward, owned for life, foreign slaves that you can buy and rule over harshly. I dealt with a lot of the different apologetics, and I would suggest watching that chapter. Biblical slavery is a huge problem. It's a massive problem for Christianity. It's a massive problem if you want to believe in a timeless, good, all-loving God that loves all people, not just his particular divisions. Because slavery is bad, guys. Slavery is really, really awful. And to allow your people to do it and to never condemn it is a huge problem. So go back and watch episode chapter 25. And if you're thinking about, your classic apologetics that defend slavery, I probably have a counter argument in that episode. A nightmare chapter. I never realized that it was there, and it was a bit of a surprise for me. This is a chapter where God's like, okay, keep these commands, keep these laws, or else. This is the threat part. The early part of the chapter starts with, this is the reward you'll get. And it's very short. The reward is tiny compared to the rest of the chapter, which is all the threats. Okay? So that should say something to you. It's probably because these people could only think of like very few rewards, but they could think of a lot of trouble that they could get into. But they're just like, oh, the good thing is going to be rain. Literally what the season does. It says rain will come in its season. Then I will give you your rains in their season. It's not even extra rains. It's not even like extra sun or rain. It's just like what will already have naturally been happening. That's what's going to happen. So there's really no reward. Your fruit field will yield its fruit. That was already seemingly going to happen. But he's just saying like the natural thing that seems to naturally happen, that will happen. And then if you don't do it, well, I'm going to start really messing with you. And the first thing I'm going to do to mess with you is I'm not going to let the thing do its natural thing. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to mess with that. So I'm going to do nothing if you guys do everything. And I brought up in verse 5 that Abraham had kept all of God's laws and decrees and all the good things that he told them to do, and yet he still was confronted by a famine and had to pimp his wife. And it's important because God is inconsistent, right? Like if you follow his commands and you're righteous, he's not necessarily going to do what he says here. Like he's changed his mind. He's developed. Now he says he's going to do it. But back then, that wasn't how he behaved. He sent a famine. Guys, you should really pay attention to these things, because if God is inconsistent, then he either changes, and so them saying that he doesn't change isn't true, or it's just because people are writing it. People are writing it. They go, oh, it's amazing. There's 40 writers writing 66 books over how many thousand years. It's not that amazing. There's tons of contradictions. It's full of nonsense. It doesn't work. God is inconsistent. The character changes constantly. What are you talking about? It's not amazing at all. It's exactly what you would expect to happen. And this stuff in this chapter is just mob boss mentality, okay? I wouldn't want anything bad to happen. I wouldn't want your house to burn down. I wouldn't want a hyena to come and eat your baby. You got to pay me protection. In this case, he's like, you got to do what I say. A lot of things you got to do is feed the priests and pay money to consecrate certain people or to whatever. We'll see that in the next chapter. But a lot of this is paying protection. That's literally what you have to do. And also not wearing mixed fabrics. But you know what I mean? You got to do what I tell you, or else I'm going to take you out back. By the way, nothing like this is happening today. Like it just doesn't come true. People are not following these laws. Everybody's wearing mixed fabrics and sowing seeds, fields with different seeds or whatever. Like there's a lot of people that are sleeping with men if they're men. All those things are happening. And it says that he'll consume their eyes. Also, that all sorts of animals will come into your towns and your enemies and blah, blah, blah. Well, this stuff isn't happening. That's just not true. God's failing. God isn't doing what he said he was going to do. We can do what we want. It's just simply not true. But hey, look, maybe the ordinances that he said to do forever don't matter to him anymore. He changes his mind constantly. Of course, there's the verse in there that says, I will drive you to cannibalism, essentially. You'll eat your sons and your daughters. You got to remember that this is an all-powerful God, so he could have it any way he wants. Literally any way he wants, okay? There's nothing that has to happen. So he could be like, I will remove the bad apples from your bunch, and then you guys will flourish. That could have been an option. But instead he's like, no, I'm going to rip your eyes out and you're going to eat your kids. That's the thing that I want. That's my whim. That's how I want things to go down. I'm going to send a bunch of animals. That's me. That's the stuff that I could come up with. That was my best plan. I think that's necessary. That's what I want. That's what I like. It sounds good to me. I love you. You know what I mean? As a Christian, you'll probably say, well, we're not under this law anymore. This doesn't apply to us. That was an old covenant. That's still God. That's still the God that decided this was the way to do things. These were still his best ideas. You can't separate that. That's so disingenuous. And you're lying to yourself, by the way. I don't care. I don't believe it. You're the one that's believing it, and you're believing in this particular God, and you're probably limiting yourself. You're probably sacrificing something in your life for a God who wanted to suck out people's eyes and have them eat their children. Like he's like, that's what I'm going to have you do. That's the result. And it's not a natural result, by the way, because nobody's doing it now. No one's eating their kids, as far as I know. You know what I mean? It's just not reasonable. It's what he arbitrarily chose. And even if it was a natural result of these particular behaviors, it's because he would have made it that way. He would have made it in such a way that if you mix fabrics, naturally speaking, and eat shellfish, naturally speaking, you will eventually eat your children. Like that is the world he created from scratch, deliberately and specifically the way he wanted it to his specifications. And that's the God you want to worship. And you go, no, but he's love and he's just and he's righteous. These are verses that if you actually take them at face value for what they are saying, you will be forced to reject this God. Because you would say, I want to believe in a God that's good, that's just, that's loving. And that's not here. That's not this. That doesn't work. with this text, it's a failure. So just dump the book, guys. And I noticed this thing that is really, really important, and I want everybody to really pay attention to this, okay? We are going to read somewhere in this book that God gave laws that were impossible for people to do. He was going to make laws and commands that were difficult to keep. I think this is a New Testament thing, and that is why Jesus is going to come and fulfill the law and be done with it so that you don't have to be under the law anymore, because it's impossible to keep the law. It's impossible to do that. That's a biblical doctrine. That's a Christian doctrine, okay? If that's the case, then this chapter tells us what God is inevitably going to do to these people, knowing that they couldn't keep the law. Right? He's made a law so that he can suck their eyes out and make them eat their children. And he knows that they can't keep it. He knows that the law is flawed. He knows all of those things. He's all-knowing. And he also admits to it later on, right? So when we read these things of the punishments, the consequences of not following this law and not adhering to it, it's God setting them up for these punishments. He wants to do these. That's why he's giving them such difficult laws. That's a monster. That's an evil villain. Do these impossible things. And if you don't, I'm going to beat you up. Well, obviously you couldn't do it. I'm going to beat you up. And it's just crazy because it seems so obvious that God isn't real. Like, it's just such nonsense, right? This is what I mean when I say that the doctrine of Christianity in the book and all those things are incoherent. They don't make sense conceptually together as ideas, right? I don't know why you haven't dumped the book yet. So then we get on to the last chapter of Leviticus chapter 27, and I'm pretty sure it's about human sacrifice with some caveats. You can pay to have certain people redeemed, right? We have a list of the values of these people. These values come from God directly. So this is what he thinks is the value of human lives based on age, because people will say that human life has intrinsic value, that you and I and everyone else, an old lady and a young man and everyone else in between, has the same intrinsic value, that God values us all the same and we're all important to him, etc. Well, this chapter, it just flies in the face of that. Your value is tied to your age and gender, or should I say sex. That is really where that value comes from. And this is God speaking. This is Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, a man of this particular age is the most valuable, 50 shekels of silver. Like, that's what you have to pay to redeem this person from God. That's crazy. I tried to do a bit of a search to find out what this chapter was. I believe the word in Hebrew is harem. I learned this from Arch Thinker. If you check out YouTube here, there's a person called Arch Thinker, and she's very well read and knowledgeable when it comes to the Bible and things like that. And she was saying that this was harem. So like if there are captives or different things like that, you would dedicate them to Yahweh. And a lot of these, as we can see in one of the later verses here, verse 29, no one devoted to destruction, and that would be that harem thing, who shall be devoted among men shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. So there is some human sacrifice going on here, and there's other tithes and taxes that are being paid to the priest. Look, a lot of it's just kind of boring, and I don't understand exactly what's happening culturally to compel them to do this sort of thing. But what is really important to note, and what I wanted to just sort of like spell out here, is 100% this chapter is speaking about human sacrifice that Yahweh is allegedly commanding. Okay, so Yahweh wants certain people killed for him. He wants to see people killed, human beings, by the way, killed and dedicated to him and completely put to death. And that's disgusting. You might find a reason to think that that's okay. but that's because you are morally bankrupt and you think that everything that happens in this Bible is perfectly fine. Anyway, that's it. That's the end of Leviticus. Guys, we got through Leviticus, and it was brutal. Like I said in one of the chapters, it started out just like talking about killing a bunch of animals, and we were all like, that's disgusting, that's brutal. But maybe this is just them trying to desensitize us so that when we reach the top of the pinnacle, we see here in verse 29, hey, by the way, kill people. This is just like getting more and more and more brutal to the point where we're like, you are going to kill people. And these people are probably like, well, we got to do what we're told, because did you read the previous chapter where he said he was going to suck our eyes out? That was the most impactful one for me. There's a lot of threats in there. Go back and read them. There's like countless threats. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate people that watch and make it through these episodes because they are long. We're going to be starting Numbers and see what happens in that book. I think there's going to be a lot of genealogy and a lot of stuff that's super boring, but we're going to try to power through it. In the meantime, I have a few special episodes coming out, so enjoy those. I also want to thank everyone that's become a member on the channel. The memberships are growing, and people are watching the videos a couple weeks ahead of time and are able to check out my live streams that have been archived. I keep the live streams up for about 2 weeks and then I archive them. But if you're a member, you can watch them as much as you want. So again, thanks for subscribing, commenting, liking, and being a part of this journey with me. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.